an anthology of readings of Almighty God's words.
God Himself, the unique. 8. God is the source of life for all things. 2. The daily food and drink God prepares for mankind. Tell me, is there anything that God does, regardless of whether it is a big thing or a small thing, that has no value or meaning? Everything He does has value and meaning. Let's discuss this from a question people often talk about. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? How do you answer this? The chicken came first, that's for sure. Why did the chicken come first? Why couldn't the egg have come first? Doesn't the chicken hatch from the egg? Eggs hatch chickens. Chickens incubate eggs. After incubating the egg for 21 days, the chicken hatches. That chicken then lays eggs, and chickens again hatch from the eggs. So did the chicken or the egg come first?
The chicken.
You answer chicken with certainty. Why is that so?
The Bible says God created birds and beasts.
That is based on the Bible. I want you to talk about your own knowledge to see if you have any actual knowledge of God's actions. Are you sure about your answer or not?
God created the chicken, then gave it the ability to reproduce life.
What ability?
The ability to incubate eggs, and the ability to make life continue on.
This explanation is about right. Do any other brothers or sisters have an opinion?
First the chicken, and then the egg.
This is certain. It's not a very profound mystery, but people of the world see it as very profound and use philosophy for their reasoning. In the end, they still don't have a conclusion. This thing is akin to man not knowing that he was created by God. Man does not know this principle, and they also aren't clear on whether the egg or the chicken should come first. They don't know what should come first, so they're always unable to find the answer. Then tell me, should the chicken or the egg have come first? It is very normal that the chicken came first. If the egg came before the chicken, then that would be abnormal. The chicken definitely came first. This is such a simple thing. It doesn't require you to be very knowledgeable. God created all of this. His initial intention was for man to enjoy it. Once there's the chicken, the egg comes naturally. Isn't that obvious? If the egg was created first, wouldn't it still need the chicken to incubate it? Creating the chicken directly is so much easier. So God created the chicken directly, and the chicken could lay eggs and also incubate the baby chicks, while man could eat chicken too. Isn't that so convenient? The way God does things is succinct and not cumbersome. The egg also has an ancestor, and that's the chicken. What God created was a living thing. Corrupted mankind really is absurd and ridiculous, always getting entangled in these simple things, and in the end, even coming up with a whole bunch of absurd fallacies. So childish. The relationship between the egg and the chicken is clear. The chicken came first. That's the most correct explanation, the most correct way to understand it, and the most correct answer. This is right. At the start, we talked about mankind's living environment and what God did, prepared, and dealt with for this environment. as well as the relationships between all things God prepared for mankind, and how God dealt with these relationships to prevent all things from causing harm to mankind. God also resolved the various elements brought by all things and the negative influences they had on mankind's environment, allowed all things to maximize their functions, brought mankind a favorable environment, and made every element beneficial, enabling mankind to adapt to such an environment and continue the cycle of reproduction and life normally. Next was the food needed by the human body, daily food and drink. This is also a necessary condition of mankind's survival. That is to say, the human body cannot live by just breathing, with just the sunlight or the wind, or just suitable temperatures. They also need to fill their stomachs. These things to fill their stomachs have also been entirely prepared by God for mankind. This is the source of mankind's food. After seeing these rich and plentiful produce, the sources of mankind's food and drink, can you say that God is the source of the supply for mankind and all things? You can absolutely say so. If God had only created trees and grass, or just various living things when He created all things, and mankind could not eat any of them, would mankind have been able to survive until now? What if the various living things and plants among all things that God created were all for cattle and sheep to eat, or for zebras, deer, and various other kinds of animals? For instance, lions eat foods like zebras and deer. Tigers eat foods such as lambs and pigs. But there was not a single thing suitable for humans to eat. Would that work? It would not. If it were like that, then mankind would not have been able to continue surviving. What if humans only ate tree leaves? Would that work? Human stomachs would not be able to take it. You won't know if you don't try it, but once you do, you'll know very well. Then, could you eat the grass prepared for cattle and sheep? It might be okay if you just try a little bit, but if you keep eating it over the long run, you won't last long. Some things can be eaten by animals, but if humans eat them, they will be poisoned. There are some poisonous things that animals can eat without affecting them, but humans can't do the same. God created human beings, so God knows best the principles and structure of the human body and what humans need. God is perfectly clear on its composition and content, what it needs, as well as how the internal organs of the human body function, absorb, eliminate, and metabolize. People are not clear on this, and sometimes eat and supplement blindly. They supplement too much and end up causing an imbalance. If you eat these things God prepared for you, and eat and enjoy them normally, there will be nothing wrong with you. Even if sometimes you are in a bad mood and you have blood stasis, it doesn't matter. You just need to eat a type of plant, and the stasis will clear up. God has prepared all of these things. In God's eyes, mankind is far above any other living thing. God prepared living environments for all kinds of plants, and prepared food and living environments for all kinds of animals. But only mankind's requirements toward their own living environment are strictest and most intolerant of neglect. Otherwise, mankind would not be able to continue developing and reproducing and living normally. God knows this best in His heart. When God did this thing, He placed more importance on it than anything else. Perhaps you are unable to feel the importance of some insignificant thing you see and enjoy, or something you feel you were born with and can enjoy. But God had already prepared it for you a long time ago. God has eliminated and resolved to the biggest extent possible all the negative factors that are unfavorable to mankind and can hurt the human body. What does this make clear? Does it make clear God's attitude toward mankind when He created them this time? What was that attitude? God's attitude was rigorous and serious, and He did not tolerate the interference of any factors or conditions or any enemy forces apart from God. From this, you can see God's attitude when He created mankind and manages mankind this time. What is God's attitude? Through the living and survival environment mankind enjoys, as well as their daily food and drink and daily needs, we can see God's attitude in maintaining the reproduction and living of mankind, and the responsibility He has toward them, as well as God's determination to save mankind this time. Can we see the authenticity of God through these things? Can we see God's wondrousness? Can we see God's unfathomability? Can we see God's omnipotence? God simply uses His almighty and wise way to supply all of mankind, as well as to supply all things. Speaking of which, after I have said so much, are you able to say that God is the source of life for all things?
Yes.
Absolutely. This is for certain. God's supply of all things is sufficient to show that God is the source of life for all things, because He is the source of supply that has enabled all things to exist, live, reproduce, and continue on. Apart from God, there is no other. He supplies all needs of all things and all needs of mankind, regardless of whether it is the most basic needs, what people need daily, or the supply of the truth to people's spirits. From all perspectives, when it comes to God's identity and His status for mankind, only God Himself is the source of life for all things. This is absolutely certain. God is the ruler, master, and supplier of this material world that people can see with their eyes and feel. For mankind, is this not God's identity? This is entirely true. So when you see birds flying in the sky, you should know that God created things that can fly. But there are living things that swim in the water, and they also survive in different ways. The trees and plants that live in the soil sprout in spring, and bear fruit, and lose leaves in autumn, and by winter all the leaves have fallen, and they go through the winter. That's their way of survival. God created all things, each of which lives through different forms and different ways, and uses different methods to exhibit its power and form of life. No matter what method, it is all under God's rule. What is the purpose of God ruling over all the different forms of life and living beings? Is it for the sake of mankind's survival?
Yes.
He controls all of the laws of life for the sake of mankind's survival, This shows just how important mankind's survival is for God. Can you see that now? Mankind being able to survive and reproduce normally is of the utmost importance to God. Therefore, God constantly supplies mankind and all things. He supplies all things in different ways, and under the circumstances of maintaining the survival of all things, He enables mankind to continue moving forward so as to maintain humanity's normal existence. These are the two aspects we are communicating today. What are these two aspects?
From the macro perspective, God created the living environment for mankind. That's the first aspect. Also, God prepared these material things that mankind needs and can see and touch.
We have communicated our main topic through these two aspects. What is our main topic?
God is the source of life for all things.
You should now have some understanding of why I communicated such content under this topic. Has there been any discussion unrelated to the main topic? None, right? Perhaps after hearing these things, some of you might gain some understanding and feel that these words are very important. But others might just have a bit of literal understanding and feel that these words don't matter. Regardless of how you present here, understand this right now. Over the course of your experience, there will come a day when your understanding reaches a certain point. That is, when your knowledge of God's actions and God Himself reaches a certain point, you will use your own practical words to deliver a profound and true testimony of God's actions. I think your understanding now is still quite simple and literal. But are you at least able to, after listening to me communicate these two aspects, recognize what methods God uses to supply mankind, or what things God supplies to mankind? Do you have a basic concept as well as a basic understanding? But are these two aspects I communicated related to the Bible?
No.
Are they related to God's judgment and chastisement in the age of kingdom?
No.
Then why did I communicate these two aspects? Is it because people must understand them to know God?
Yes.
It is very necessary to know these, and it is also very necessary to understand these. Don't just be restricted to the Bible, and don't just be restricted to God's judgment and chastisement of man to understand everything about God. What is the purpose of me jumping out of the scope of communicating the Bible and stepping out of God's words from the age of kingdom? It's to let people know that God is not just the God of His chosen people. You currently follow God, and He is your God. But for those outside of the people who follow God, is God their God? Is God the God of all people outside of those who follow Him?
Yes.
Then is God the God of all things?
Yes.
Then does God do His work and perform His actions merely on those who follow Him?
No.
Its scope is the entire universe. From the small perspective, its scope is all of mankind and among all things. From the big perspective, it's the entire universe. So we can say God does His work and performs His actions among all mankind. This is sufficient to let people know all about God Himself. If you want to know God and truly get to know and understand Him, then don't just be restricted to the 3 stages of God's work, and don't just be restricted to the stories of the work God had once performed. If you try to know Him that way, then you are confining God to a certain limit. You're seeing God as too insignificant. What influences would such consequences bring to you? You would never be able to know God's wondrousness and supremacy, and you would never be able to know God's power and omnipotence and the scope of His authority. Such an understanding would influence your ability to accept the truth that God is the ruler of all things, as well as your knowledge of God's true identity and status. In other words, if your understanding of God is limited in scope, what you can receive is also limited. That is why you must expand the scope and open your horizons. Whether it is the scope of God's work, God's management, and God's rule, or all things ruled over and managed by God, you should get to know it all and get to know God's actions therein. Through such a way of understanding, you will unconsciously feel that God is ruling over, managing, and supplying all things among them. At the same time, you will also truly feel that you are a part of all things and a member of all things. As God supplies all things, you also accept God's rule and supply. This is a fact no one can deny. All things are subject to their own laws, which is under God's rule, and all things have their own rule of survival, which is also under God's rule, while mankind's fate and what they need are also closely related to God's rule and His supply. That is why, under God's dominion and rule, mankind and all things are interconnected, interdependent, and interwoven. This is the purpose and value of God's creation of all things. Do you understand this now?
Yes.
If you understand, then let's finish up our communication here today. Goodbye.